Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Kanan, and I'm the COO of Stranger's Guide. We're an award-winning publication that commissions stories from local writers and photographers to build authentic portraits of place from Scandinavian Tehran to Colombia and Lagos. Learn more about what we do at strangersguide.com or connect with me after this session. I'm pleased to introduce today's panel. Nikki Brooks is a decorated 32-year Army veteran who is now Director of Federal Services for Optiv. She most recently served as the Director of Intelligence for the Army Futures Command, where she was responsible for the strategic management of intelligence and security support. Simone Ledeen has served in various U.S. government and business leadership positions, most recently as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism, where she served as the U.S. Defense Policy Lead for Irregular Warfare, Sensitive Special Operations, Key Military Information Support Operations involving cyber and disinformation, direct action, personnel recovery, hostage issues, and counterterrorism activities. Kevin Lynch is Chief Executive Officer and a board member for Optiv, the cyber advisory and solutions leader. He's a seasoned executive with 35 years of strategic and operating experience, largely in professional and technical services, operating at scale within private and public environments. Lieutenant General Stephen M. Twitty became the 38th Commander of 1st Army on July 15, 2016. Lieutenant General Twitty served as a Joint Chiefs of Staff intern in the Directorate for Strategic Plans and Policy in the Pentagon, as a speechwriter for the Army G3, and as a G3 Operations Officer with V Corps in Heidelberg, Germany, including Operation Joint Endeavor in Tezar, Hungary. He has many awards and decorations, including the Distinguished Service Medal, Silver Star Medal, and the Bronze Star Medal. Please join me in welcoming everyone to the stage.
Take this over here.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Right. First of all, thanks for coming in here. We're really happy to be here at South by Southwest. That was a pretty impressive opening. That was good, right? Today we're going to talk about the global competition, the rise of AI, and the impacts of that that we're seeing every single day. So as I put my glasses on here because I can't see anything, I'm going to actually start with Kevin on the first question.
Oh boy.
We're just going to dive right into it so that we have plenty of time for questions at the end. So Kevin, we're going to start with the fact that, what's going on in Russia, with Russia and the Ukraine crisis. What I guess I would ask you is, what type of threats should we be expecting here at home?
Well, I think it's obviously a pertinent topic. You only have to walk by a monitor and we're all glued to what's happening. And the attacks that we're seeing in Ukraine, there was another swiper attack just yesterday on government assets. That's happening, to a lesser extent, but increasingly here in the US. Mm-hmm. And I think importantly in our NATO allies. I saw one report this week that talked about probes into infrastructure are up 4x in the United States over the last 4 weeks. So clearly we're seeing an increase in the penetration attempts into our networks. Mm-hmm. I can even tell you that being here in Austin, I had 3 on my endpoint yesterday alone that weren't caught by our traditional filters, but effectively got through, but we're social engineering based, right? So it's pervasive. I think we're all watching that situation and scenario and wondering, will it go beyond that traditional DDoS, phishing, social engineering at a corporate level, and will it impact into critical infrastructure? Mm-hmm. And whether that's here or in our NATO allies, and would that precipitate an Article 5 escalation? And that's really the big question. If we get into food, water, energy, or communications, really critical infrastructure. And I can tell you on the client base for us, it's at the top of the minds of those executive teams. We're doing double duty to help prepare them, for eventual attacks.
Mm-hmm. So, Simone, I'm going to hand it over to you on this one. So, if you think about what's going on over there, what should we be expecting from China right now?
Well, I think there have been some very interesting signs, especially in the last few days. So they've been seeing what we've been seeing, which is a very interesting collapse of Russia's logistics and their failure to be able to anticipate what Ukraine is doing, like kind of a traditional insurgency that they've started. And so I think a lot of people, a lot of Russia watchers were caught off guard. And I think China has also been surprised. And I think a clear indication of that is the recent request from Russia for Chinese different, Chinese material and rockets and even Chinese MREs. And China's made it clear they're not interested. They're not interested in providing that type of support. And I think that is quite significant. I think not only are they surprised by Russia's across-the-board failures, but I think they're also concerned about the level of hurt that the sanctions have already been, have demonstrated. So it's not just U.S. sanctions. It's some EU sanctions, and other countries are blocking Russian activity. Russian financial activity. I think for China, they don't want to enter that. They don't want to enter that discussion. They have their own problems. They have their own very grave economic problems. So I think if the combat scenario had perhaps gone in a different way, and the kinetic battles between Russia and Ukraine, if Russia had succeeded in their kind of initial push and had made it to Kyiv and had made it to, had executed their plan, if they had a plan, which is unclear right now, but I think perhaps it would have been, the Chinese scenario would have been different. But I think now, what is the upside for them in getting involved? It's hard to see an upside for them.
Yeah, okay. So Jones, I guess I would ask you from that, taking that stance, I'm going to switch up my original question then and go with, putting Putin in a box, so to speak. He's backed up into a corner. Yeah. What do you think we can expect from him?
So let me give you a scenario that is not probable, but maybe likely. And so if you take today, the war effort is pretty much regulated in Ukraine. Let's just say, whether it's inadvertent or advertent, that some bomb or missile or what have you lands in a NATO country. And now you bring NATO to Article 5. NATO gets involved in the war and so forth. Then you have the West against Russia. I don't think China could stand for that. I could see China then backing Russia, and opportunistic China perhaps going for Taiwan. And oh, by the way, if this happened, we're truly in a bipolar world. The other piece of this that we have to think about, go back to your history books of World War I and World War II. We sent forces from the US abroad to Europe. The homeland was pretty much safe. The homeland fed the war effort. In this case here, if you're talking about World War III, the homeland's not going to be safe, because what you will truly have is cyber touching our supply lines of communications, our power projection platforms. Most of the military is not abroad. It is here at home. And so we have to power project ourselves to places around the world. That could be easily impacted by Russia or China. The banking system in which we all enjoy and live every day could be impacted, the rail system, and so forth. So World War III would not be your grandfather's war where we go off and fight a land war abroad and nothing happens in the US. And so I'm telling you the worst case scenario. I've spent a lot of time in NATO. I just retired out of the Army from NATO. And I will tell you, that's a lot to think about. And then the next question would lead, and I won't answer it fully. It'll be a rhetorical question. So what do we do about it? Anyway.
So, well, I'm going to follow up with Kevin. If you think about what can industry do to kind of take care of the homeland, right? And so, I know you have some really big thoughts on this area. So, like to share those.
Well, I'd love to. I can't help but comment on what Simone and the general spoke about, though. It's really interesting to watch China in this environment because I do think you see stylistic differences in terms of the nation-state threat.
That's right.
And I think China's in a very unique position. I could be wrong or right with this. My perspective is that if you go find any book that you can find on any Amazon website around a three-party game, and look at the strategy of winning a three-party game, it's really uniquely different than winning in a two-party game, right? I think to China today, with their issues, but their desire to be a global currency, their pathway today is one of moderating peace. I think that's why they're not at the table provisioning. They're buying an option effectively in that three-party game. Once it destabilizes, if it were to destabilize, if it was unfortunately destabilized, that strategy will change precipitously. And I think I would support the general's view that Taiwan is the target. You come back home, to the general's point, this homeland would be put at risk. And there are things we need to do today that prepare for that. I mean, I'm a big believer in this notion of collective defense or multi-tenancy in the way we think about cybersecurity. There's often this analogy that's thrown out: if you owned a building here in town, would you build a fire department just for the building? Or would you build a more rigorous fire department to defend all the buildings in town? And I think we have missed that so far in capitalizing our security infrastructure and our resilience infrastructure and not thinking about a collective defense. I do think there are structural problems, however, to make that happen. So I think we need better incentives. I've published on this because I believe today when you look at the commercial side of the world, notwithstanding the federal side of the world, you have competitive intensity. And so an organization is going to spend on security and resilience against their mission and against their affordability. But if I'm in a competitive state with three other players and I overspend and they underspend, why would I be incented to help them? The reality is, unless we get there, I think we're fighting a losing battle in terms of security. But right now, the incentive structure is misaligned. Is it things like we have today in terms of carbon credits where we have cyber credits? Or is it a national coalition where we have tax incentives for those companies to collaborate and share threat information? I think the latter is actually very feasible. I think the first is more provocative, but we're going to have to do something more than we're doing today to get companies to come forward and play together. That collective defense, I think, is our only real viable option.
Great.
Yeah, so I think that's a great answer, sir. I think as we talk about how do we create that defense in depth, right, for our homeland, I think the biggest thing that we'll have to think through is how we create cyber superiority in order to project the power that General Twitty was just describing and sustain that power, but as well as having that information advantage, it being the byproduct of that and being able to help our decision makers throughout that. And I feel like industry, as you so passionately are involved in, will be hugely impactful.
I think it's going to take industry and players that today are competitors and collaborators and partnerships and to start thinking as an ecosystem, from tools to solutions to services to capabilities, and start to patchwork that together. It's going to require the formation of really unique ecosystems to do that.
So recently in the news, Russia has stated that if anybody hacks their satellite systems, that's an act of war. And I know, General Twitty, as you and I had talked about before, that there's a lot of tools in the tool bag before you say you go kinetic. How would you, perceive that first comment by their space leader, but also how would we respond? Do you feel like that is a provocative statement just to get attention, or do you think that is actually a true approach? I mean, a true response for?
Yeah, so a couple of points on that. Number one, if you noticed a couple of weeks ago, there was some saber rattling by the Russians about nuclear. And the reason why you don't hear the U.S. with a response on nuclear is because our U.S. policy is that we don't talk about our nuclear capability and our nuclear power. That is, in fact, our policy. And obviously you can understand why they're we don't need to be doing any saber rattling about nuclear weapons. And I have the same mindset when it comes to cyber saber rattling and even space saber rattling. There are a lot of things that are going on in our cyber sphere that we don't need to be talking about. But the statement that was made with the cyber saber rattling is we need to think about it in detail. And let me tell you my thoughts on it. And so, we look at 5 domains in the military: land, sea, air, space, and cyber. In the military, we're extremely comfortable with working on the ground. I'm an Army general. I've spent 40 years in the Army, all as an infantryman, very comfortable with operating on the ground. Air Force, pretty comfortable with calling Air Force Air to get me out of trouble. Navy, pretty comfortable with that. Where it is uncomfortable is the sea and cyberspace for a couple of reasons. Number one, with the 3 I just talked about, there are international norms and rules about how we do business, international norms and rules. We don't invade, at least in the modern world, we don't invade other countries. In the sea, we stay 12 nautical miles off the shores of other countries. In the air, we don't invade their airspace. But you take a look at cyber and you take a look at space, there are no international norms in which we're supposed to operate. And so getting to the question, what is war in cyber, and I'll add space, well, we don't know. And when we're going through our calculus here, whether it be in the Pentagon, which I've served plenty of, or in the White House, we first look at what is our vital interest and our national interest. In other words, what's really going to take us to war? Is it worth putting human boots on the ground to do this? And in the case of a Russian attacking a satellite, one would say, possibly not. But what is the effect of the Russians attacking our satellite? Is it going to take down some critical infrastructure or impact our vital interests or our national interests? Then maybe you do go to war. And so there's more to that question that needs to be brought out and put into our calculus as we assess whether or not we go to war over cyber, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like we just don't have a digital Geneva Convention. So,
Yeah.
so from that perspective, Simone, where do you see like policy gaps that, or where that could be addressed?
Man, I have so much to say after
wow.
that.
I can help.
I think number one, when you're talking about cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, I think you can equate it to like a bomb going off. And we do have policies for that. Like if a foreign country sets off a bomb that destroys some type of critical infrastructure, that could reach a threshold, the threshold of war. But of course, I agree with the general statement. I mean, in general, cyber is, it's kind of considered gray zone, and the term gray zone is intentional and kind of muddied. But I would, respectfully, I think we need to start looking at some of these things in a new way. I think we're applying a lot of our traditional post-World War II model to these new domains, and I don't think that's the best way ahead. I think that I mean, for example, so you talked about, the national norms. Countries don't invade other countries. Countries stay, X nautical miles outside of other countries, space, whatever, maritime space. Russia stopped doing that. Yep. Russia has violated these national norms. And so why are they, for example, why are they still a voting member on the UN Security Council? They're not. They violated national norms. we should consider that's actually not a strong enough statement. They should be removed from the UN Security Council for violating national norms. And so you can apply that as well to like the cyber and space domains, as we just need to come together and establish norms. Like if you're gonna launch a cyber attack that will effectively, bomb one element of our critical infrastructure, yeah, we're gonna be at war. So like, be advised. I think those are things that clearly are highlighted in this specific conflict that we haven't really addressed yet, but we need to, and we really need some new thinking. I think the old way of doing business just doesn't apply in this kind of new environment that we're all operating in.
Well, that leads me to you, Kevin. On if you start thinking of rules of engagement, right, and how we think about that distorted view, right? I think is that relevant, or does it give us space to operate? I mean, is it something that could be used as opportunity, or is it really that big of a challenge?
Well, I think there are structural challenges, but they can be overcome. I'll pick up on Simone's comment because I agree with her wholeheartedly. We have to relook at this problem. And many years back, there was a lot of fervor around public-private partnerships, and that seems to go in and out of vogue over the years. But I do really think we have to revisit the notion of a public-private partnership around security and resilience, or cyber if you prefer. And I really think that, the first element for me starts with that notion of a coalition. So we create the right incentives for participation. I think the next is we have to recognize we have a massive talent deficit in this industry. There's various numbers out there. The most popularized one is 3 million unfilled jobs in cyber globally. That's a big number, right? So I think we need to really address how do we build that from the ground up? How do we propagate programs around cyber specifically and treat them not just as college environments, but also trade schools. And maybe as far as a cyber corps, much like the Peace Corps, to incent the youth into this industry as a tour of duty. Because every professional would be better off, irrespective of where they spent their time, building this capability. And then the third I think you have to really look at is, at the very heart of this public-private partnership is, I know that we've enacted this a few times nationally, but not with a lot of resolve, this notion of a national command authority around cyber resources. So that if you have a national command authority around that capability, that's not just NSA, that's industry as well. And that for industry leaders, we have to look and accept that some percentage of our population can be dedicated and on loan and seconded to and work side by side. Not creating exploits, but rather console to console, we're a collective defense so that we have surge capacity.
So you would think about reinforcing the government's defensive efforts or doing recovery operations?
I think it could be both defensive as well as restorative as well as offensive.
Okay.
And I think all of those have to be in play. I do think that's a big public-private partnership. We talk a lot and we think a lot in terms of the United States presence on that, but I actually think it's a global construct for what it's worth. And I think the US has to set the tone and the architecture for that to come to life.
So I know, John, that when it comes to coach, teach, and mentoring, that is like a big thing for you. And so the education aspect of that, I think, probably gets you pretty excited about, where can we take our future generations to support these type of efforts.
Yeah, but if I may, I want to jump on we call it the hand grenade.
Yeah.
I want to jump on the hand grenade here because I really think there's more that we can pull on here. When I take a look at, the way we operate now in the U.S. when it comes to cyber attacks or cyber defense, or you name the cyber, there's zero agility. There's plenty of bureaucratic ways in which we operate. And I'll just give you an example as the person that was responsible for day-to-day operations in Europe, the entire continent. every single day we're in competition with Russia. And every single day as Russia conducted cyber attacks, we're sitting back trying to figure out, well, whether it's Title 50 that's gonna execute, Title 10, or maybe Title 32, who's going to do it? Oh, by the way, most of the cyber operations that I thought I was in charge of, I had to send it all the way back to the US to get presidential approval. Because most of it, obviously, cyber has no boundaries. And so if we were going after a Russian cyber target, then that target could hit other countries, obviously. And so really a cumbersome process that we don't need to have. And the way I look at it, we gotta be able to operate speed of relevance. If we're not operating at speed of relevance, then we're gonna miss opportunity and we're not gonna be competing. We're gonna be sitting on the sideline and the competition is gonna be a one-man show. And so we have to be able to, number one, get rid of the bureaucratic nature in which we execute our cyber operations, flatten that network, and empower certain leaders to go off and do these things and accept the risk associated with it. If we hire smart people, people that have been trained, if we have the proper accountability, trust me, they can do it. Mm-hmm. The other piece of this is, you heard me talk about the rules and the titles. There's a place and time for that. But when you're operating in contested areas, whether it be against Russia, whether it's against China, there's nothing wrong with taking those who has the authorities and pushing those down to the commander level who has the authority in on the continent that we're dealing with. Just like the NORTHCOM commander, the STRATCOM commander, and the NSA commander, this should be a collaborative effort here in the US with them. And oh, by the way, I wholeheartedly agree with Kevin, from a commercial, from corporations, you all should take part in this as well. But there's one thing that you cannot do. Number one, sell your stuff to other governments. Number two, you got to get the proper certifications, whether that's FedRAMP or IL5 or IL6. We all have to make sure that if you want to play in this game, that we're all on the same level playing field. We're protecting our national interests. Mm-hmm. And protecting our national interests is not selling stuff to our enemies or our adversaries. Even selling our stuff to our NATO countries. And I hate to say this, could be a bad thing. And that's why we created what's called Five Eyes in the intel community. We have 30 countries in NATO, but we only have 5 countries in our Five Eye community for a reason. And so we got to be very selective of how we sell and tell and so forth, so we can protect our own U.S. interest. That was a long...
No, that was a great answer. I think I would come back on a couple things, though, to pull the thread.
Yep.
So, Kevin, if you think about the startup community, for example, right? How can they, one, actually support the federal? Because they're small. It's difficult sometimes to get in there, and it's very cumbersome. What advice would you give them, and how can we, as some of the bigger companies, be supportive?
Well, I think there's a parallelism to the general's comment around don't do certain things and be prepared and certified to serve, really, at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm passionate around this notion of a national command authority, because it creates a clearinghouse for that capability to be used, so it's controlled, right? Mm-hmm. As opposed to 500 companies go off and decide to do it in their own way. That's not going to move the needle, and it's going to be very ineffective. But then you take that exact construct and apply it to your question. How can companies of all sizes make a difference? Certainly for a smaller organization, for a startup organization, one of your jobs as a leader is strategy. One of your jobs as a leader is culture. One of your jobs as a leader is pace of the organization. But one of the most critical is capital allocation. And how do you look at your scarce capital as a startup and think, boy, do I do what the general said and get the FedRAMP certification? Or do I spend that money on generating code that can make a difference, creating more AI? I think the latter is a more effective use of the capital on average, but then it creates a gap.
Yeah.
How do you solve that gap? Well, I think you'll see the rise, and I'll use the word from a commercial sense, of an ecosystem, but you could use the same word I used earlier of a coalition. I think smaller companies need to engage in ecosystems and coalitions, partnering with others to really find a way to leverage others' certifications, access controls, second that to them, right? And do what you're really great at. Focus on where you can be truly differentiating for that coalition. I think that's the place I would look.
Yep. So Simone, you wanted something kind of spicy, so I'm going to help you out there. So if you were, having served overseas in multiple roles, can you talk about the implications? So now you absolutely understand, General Twitty, from your perspective of, we have to be careful of our intellectual property and capability because they can easily be compromised. But when you are in contested space with your allies, what are those implications and policies that we need to consider?
Great question. Thank you for slightly spicy. I wanted to comment first on something that General Twitty said and maybe expand on a little bit. The issue with flattening and changing authorities for reactions to cyber incidents, I think should also be expanded to disinformation.
Absolutely.
And I think a perfect example is exactly what we're seeing with Russia. There was a lot of smart people thought that there were going to be massive cyber attacks. There have been some small ones so far, unless they have some covert ones that are just building right now and we just haven't detected them yet. But I think they are really focused on disinformation and they've been extremely successful actually for a long time. If you see how divided our country is right now, a lot of that is due to foreign influence and successful disinformation campaigns. So I think when we talk about cyber, I think we should also, cyber is primarily the method that disinformation is distributed. So I would just add that. But
I think that's also a component of information advantage, right?
Yes.
You have information advantage when you're able to clear the deck of disinformation.
100%. What? So I got distracted. Would you mind repeating the question?
Go back to the spice.
Back to the spice. So just thinking of being deployed in contested space,
Yeah.
and when we're in the same space with our allies, and you have different capabilities, not sharing, and what the implications of that are. Sometimes, there's lots of tools to share, but there are definitely implications to not.
Exactly, and you asked this question because you know how I'm going to answer. I think we've gone back and forth in the last 20 years in the U.S. government between need to know, need to share, and the pendulum has swung back and forth several times. I think with cybersecurity, in my last job at the Pentagon, we had so many partners coming to us to ask us for help with cybersecurity, and all of their critical infrastructure was penetrated by this, that, and the other bad actor, and we do business in a lot of these countries. We have national interest, U.S. national interest in these countries, and so I think I think we need to be very flexible in terms of what we share and what we provide them. The other example that I would talk about is not a NATO partner, it's Israel. Everyone knows how highly skilled they are in this area. And this is an area where we could work really closely with them. I know that there are some sensitivities around that, but I just think we are fighting a battle that we're not winning right now. Sorry, but we're not. And so we need to reassess what we're doing, because if we continue to have this, close hold model and, everything is classified up to whatever, and there are like 5 people that have access to it, and it's not even worth building, So that's my spicy answer.
That is the spice, by the way.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to you for a second on that, Kevin, because one of the things that I learned really quickly from, when I transitioned into the private sector, right? So when the pandemic hit, how quickly we transitioned to remote, right? Being able to do that. And being from a firm, our old firm, and the fact that they are absolutely required to protect a lot of data. And we were successful. We went. So there's a lot industry could do to teach the federal government in this space. Do you engage in conversations about things like that other ways for them to consider, how they share and how they work? I mean, I think that would be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I would look at this very, very simply and say these coalitions have to be public and private. I know that's one of the questions we've got on the post effect here. It has to be granular, right? The threat intelligence that you might have in the Pentagon or the NSA could meaningfully change the course and outcome of a commercial enterprise, and vice versa. I was with a Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, as we lovingly call our clients, the other day for a few hours. He shared with me they'd had a very sizable client, very sizable organization, distributed branch network. They'd had a breach a number of years ago. What they learned from that breach and shared with their peer competitors, much to the consternation of their board of directors, who wondered, why are you doing this, and does that mean we can spend less on our defense next year, as opposed to what they really had to go do? But they shared with their competitors, and they shared obviously through federal constructs like the FBI. Hard data prevented 22 breaches. So one act of collaboration had an exponential effect. So the more we get our heads wrapped around this, the better. But I will tell you that we're all focused on breaches, and I think overly focused on ransomware, which I think will continue to be malicious. I'm worried about a different thing. So the ransomware condition has been very destructive. You can look at it through a variety of lenses. Obviously, Colonial Pipeline is called off as a case example, but there are many others. By the way, that was an IT attack, not an OT attack. And I would tell you those Purdue control systems in that pipeline are far more susceptible than the IT was. But that attack was very destructive. And I would call that critical infrastructure, and it was on the edge of being an act of war, in my opinion. But we're so focused on that, and cyber insurance coverage has gone up by orders of magnitude at this stage. It's not a 5% increase, a 10% increase. We're talking about multiples increase. And everyone's really focused on that, and how do we build more resilience and data recovery. I'm actually worried about the adversary monetizing in a different way. Because that one-to-one party relationship where adversarial will say, I'll give you your controls back, you're gonna pay me the ransomware. The FBI and others are gonna chase me for that pay at some stage. It's this adversarial condition. I'm actually worried about the rise of what I'll call malicious auctionware. You can coin that term if you want. I want no royalty from it. But malicious auctionware, where you take a deep penetrator, which we see often, that sits in an organization's environment for 2-3 years, really tabulating data. Not hard to consider that they then at some stage curate that data out into the open environment using a blockchain ledger and create an auction marketplace where that information is now sold to the highest bidder. So you get economic intensity that rises. It's a different way of monetizing the same attack. And it's actually more efficient, probably pays them more, and it's brutally impossible to track where the money goes. Brutally impossible. So I'm more worried about that kind of attack happening. It's a fundamental and wholesale shift in the attack surface to me. And I think we're on the cusp of it, in my opinion. And we won't prevent that unless we're sharing threat data across organizations. And imagine if that's a defense contractor, General Twitty. Like imagine if that's a defense contractor. The intellectual property that could go out the door, the trade flows, et cetera. This is dangerous stuff.
So we have some questions from the audience. So
number 2, because I want to talk.
you want to go with number 2? So Can you talk about the difference of rules of engagement that put limitations, U.S. versus China, on being more proactive rather than reactive to cyber attacks? So I'll start with you, General Foote.
Yeah, so I want to expand that a little bit because I think it's important to talk about it. So go back 2 years ago, a little over 2 years, when COVID first hit. I really want to talk about adaptability and being proactive. So if you remember when COVID first hit, boom, in the corporate world, you all went to work from home or work from anywhere. Boom, the grocery stores went to either you pull up to the grocery store, they gave you your food, or they dropped it off your house. Boom, the restaurants went to either they put a menu on the table or they dropped it off of your house. And I can go on and on as examples. You quickly adapted, and you're pretty proactive, and you placed in there staying power. All the things I'm talking about still out there. Now, if you take the federal government, whom I was a part of until just recently, we had to sit on the sideline and watch you all. We were very reactive in the way that we went about business. Every single day I was in my UCOM headquarters waiting for people to come to work. Everyone's scared. They got masks on. They're up against the table wondering whether they're going to get COVID or not. Until we finally saw that out here in the real world, that, hey, they've adapted to this. And so it's that mindset that we've been talking about here, particularly Simone, on how we really need to change in the way we do business and learn from each other. Particularly, we need to learn from you. So you all are a critical asset that we need to figure out how we bring you into the fold and help us move forward to where we can be agile, adaptive, and proactive the way we deal with both cyber and space.
You know, General, I got to pick up on that a little bit. Do you feel like we were, if there were only two answers to this, lucky or good, and we can be either or a little bit of both, where would you have placed the needle on that 2-year period of pivoting out of the office, pivoting out of the base, and living through that very digital experience?
Yeah, so to be quite honest with you, I would probably have to say lucky. You know, at least from my standpoint, and because I was there, I could see the Pentagon and what they were doing, although I was in Europe. We struggled. We had 50 meetings a day to figure out how we were going to handle things. We had all these PowerPoint charts, okay? So with ink spots. Those of you that served in the military, you know we're PowerPoint crazy. And I see old Joe Costa over there, good to see you. And we put PowerPoint charts just to make leaders feel happy about life. And we tried to figure out through PowerPoint instead of really figuring it out through you all. And we got there through luck, I would say, and some prudent planning as a result of really trying to make it happen. But if I had to pick, it's the luck piece.
I would tend to agree with you, by the way. I mean, I asked the question for the perspective, but I think all of those shifts in our modality were all predicated on connectivity. Yeah. And if you attacked the ability to connect digitally, that distributed model does not work. Right, it does not work. And we see big societal distress. And I actually think we changed fundamentally the pattern of work. We're never going back to the old way of working. Everyone likes to use the convenient term of hybrid. But what does that really mean? It means the attack surface got dramatically bigger and it didn't recess, right? You now had people working from home 5 days a week, but what will it be in the future? 2? Yeah. They're still working from home with critical data on a non-hardened, line of communication with probably an average of 9 to 15 smart devices in the home that are also not hardened, that are all access points. So I think we got lucky, and I think we actually have to double down on this to match the the distributed nature of our workforce these days.
Yeah, that's it. And you have all those on net like that, right? You just multiplied by hundreds percent on your vulnerabilities, right? You just added that on there. And I think the next question really, again, this time I'll start with Kevin. How will AI change the future of cyber attacks and warfare?
Well, I'll just start with my philosophy on AI. Incredibly powerful in its use. So I hope I don't offend anyone in the audience when I say this. Mm-hmm. But when you look broadly in industry and the application of AI, it's a bottom feeder. Most disruptive innovation is bottom fed, right? It feeds up into the value chain. And AI is no different, except for in cyber, with more work to go. So as we've gone through continued digital transformation, what was it? Someone shared over $7 trillion of global GDP is now digitized in terms of trade flows. So we are bottom feeding our way to a very digital environment. AI is critical to that. In cyber, it plays a really critical role from a commercial lens, and we can come to warfare, but it plays a really critical role because when businesses think about AI, it's often distilled down to one of two things. The ability to move faster, because speed matters. I often talk about speed being the new basis of competition. And the second thing is the scale of our businesses is dramatically different, and the scale of data is dramatically different. And so AI is a phenomenal ability for us to go faster and deal with far more distributed and nonlinear data, right? Mm-hmm. And it's something that the general and I talked about in one of our first get-togethers was this notion of delegation of authority. In most organizations, we're not great at that, and we under-delegate, in my opinion. In cyber, we have delegated to AI the ability to transit across broad swaths of data and bring back insight, and to make certain level of decisions, taking man out of the loop, so we can move at the speed of the threat. And I think there's an impending kind of tough conversation to be had around, will we take the man, no gender reference made there, by the way, more out of the loop and put more and more to automation, so that collective defense can be done for us. Right up to the point where I don't think we're ever going to go to the point where it's completely man out of the loop, especially when it comes to critical national infrastructure.
Simone, you had...
Yeah, I think so. I think fundamentally what we're talking about also is, risk management and what is our risk appetite. I think up until this point, our U.S. government leadership wants to keep their hands, they want to be the decision makers at the highest levels. So, all of these operations, it's so rare to have a leader like General Twitty who's really, advocates for pushing down decision making to the lowest level, because that's how you're that's how you're effective. You can respond quickly. If you have 12 layers of approvals to get through, at the time of decision, the question's no longer relevant. Yep. So I think that applies in so many areas specific to cybersecurity, and I think AI is making a lot of these decision makers uncomfortable because it does take decision points away from them in many instances. And so I am excited about it because we need it. It's a complete game changer, and in my opinion, people who are involved in this, who are working in cybersecurity and are not working on, AI applications, are going to get lost. They're going to get left behind, because it's really about the ability of, managing data and understanding data and using this deep understanding of data to, to apply it in these instances. So I think I'm excited about the future AI and cyber, and I think it's going to be incredible to see and learn about all the applications that so many people are developing right now. And
I would add a couple things to that, though. So AI, one of the limitations initially would be just in any organization in leadership, there's a trust that needs to be built. And so as, you know, in my former life as an intelligence officer, I had to develop trust with my boss, right? So that when I am presenting that information to him, there is a trust that he knew I did my due diligence. I've seen kind of the reaction to, here's the information. They're not sure they can quite trust it, right? I mean, I even had him questioning it when I was, you know, we were bringing in the UAVs for the first time, and I can see it, I'm looking at it. And he, you know, it was still not yet the trust. So there will be some leadership challenges to that as you go forward. And so to General Switty, I mean, how would you deal with that?
Yeah, so I got a couple of points there. And so obviously there is some leadership challenge, and you hit it on the head, is trust. You know, one of the things with the trust is, so what are the algorithms that we put into the AI gonkulator that says, I trust these algorithms to produce the product that I'm looking for, to make a decision, to inform me, to reduce risk, to exploit opportunities, what have you. What are they? And until I'm comfortable with those algorithms, then I agree with you. It is untrusted information for me, would be my first point. And then the other point that I would make is, I don't ever see us taking, when it comes to warfare is an extremely human thing. So I don't ever see taking humans out of the loop when it comes to AI.
That's right.
What I see is the AI as an enhancement. Yeah, there will be certain decisions that will be made with AI, but overall, there will be a human in that loop, and it will continue to be a very humanistic war in my mind.
The definition of war here is interesting because I agree with the general that in a warfare sense, it's a nuclear construct. I don't want a computer deciding to launch a missile. I want a man to decide that, a human being, I should say. But in the commercial sense today, if you take the anatomy of a breach and really lay it out on the operating table, every single minute matters.
That's right.
That breach is followed by longitudinal movement throughout a network. And so if there's too long of a pause and dwell to contemplate decisions, or Simone, to use your example, multiple layers of escalation as contemplated in decisions, that's crucially explosive for a commercial company. Crucially.
And sorry, I feel like I just need to clarify, I was not advocating for removing humans from decisions.
And I didn't insinuate.
I feel like I just needed to say that.
I did not insinuate that.
Same, but AI has to be used to really like segment and sequester that threat at its point of isolation, then bring human intelligence into it. And again, I would apply a different construct around a server that's got, you know, corporate data on it than I would the operation of critical infrastructure around power, telecom, water, food.
Well, this kind of goes in that conversation about in depth, right? So when you think of an adversarial view of that and what the malicious code that you discovered and you were dissecting, but the intent though is to deter and to change behavior, right? And so the speed of that is absolutely critical to actually create that deterrence and that change of behavior.
Yeah, if I can hit on an example here just to bring clarity to what all three of us, I think, were talking about. When I was over as the deputy commander, European command, a Canadian helicopter went down off the coast of Greece. And I had this AI platform on my cell phone. It did an alert and said, Canadian helicopters goes down off the coast of Greece. In the old days, I would have gathered the staff. I would have tried to discern whether or not in fact true and what can we do about it and all that. I would have called 10,000 people. Because that alert happened, there was a bit of risk calculus that went on. So it was no harm for me to tell the Sixth Fleet to go and send a ship off the coast of Greece to inspect whether or not this actually happened. No harm. So I had, my risk was pretty easy to make. No one was gonna fire me for doing that. You're tracking what I'm saying? And so I executed. They went there, and in fact, there was a Canadian helicopter. The crew killed, and we brought the helicopter out and so forth. And so there's an example where I got rid of the layers and just made the decision myself. Number one, because of my experience, but number two, I knew we had time on our hand and we would never find that helicopter down at the bottom had we not made that decision. So that's a perfect example of using AI to quickly make a decision, and you suffer the consequences, whether it's the wrong decision, but this time it was the right decision.
But it allows you to make a resource allocation choice again.
There you go.
Right.
Really valuable one.
Yeah.
Those lives could have still been
There you
in
go.
harm and in peril, but saved, right?
There you go.
Great use of resource.
So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.